When designing Anno 117 Pax Romana, the Ubisoft Mainz studio has taken an existing concept and has elevated it to a new system called building buffs. It really adds some extra challenge to the game, so in this short overview we'll look at what exactly are building buffs, when do they occur, how are they applied, and finally, in what way do they add an extra gameplay layer. So let's get started with a quick explainer of the basics. What are building buffs? The general concept is pretty straightforward and technically has been around in previous Anno games. The most basic example is the marketplace. It satisfied the need for community to all citizens living within its area of effect. The same was true for a tavern. Every building within reach would have its need for amusement fulfilled. The system was effective but basic, and it didn't challenge players in any way other than to make sure as many houses as possible were covered. So how are things different for Anno 117? Using the same examples, public service buildings such as the market and tavern, in addition to fulfilling a certain need, now also provide bonuses to attributes such as population, income, or happiness. For example, every individual building within the market's area of effect now gives you an additional +1 population and +1 income, and the tavern will equally generate +1 population and +1 happiness. The most concise answer I can give you to the question, what are building buffs, is that they are effects that either increase or decrease one or more of the attribute values that you can see at the top of your screen. Now, with that definition in mind, let's take a look at how these buffs are generated. Any building with an area of effect gives us two visual indicators, the first being the actual area it influences, and secondly, you'll see green, red, or red and green arrows over buildings that indicate whether this building's buff has a positive, negative, or mixed effect. Taking this fire station for example, you see it provides a positive effect, and the tooltip shows the specific area effect it applies to each building, so +2 fire safety, and how many individual buildings will be affected by this buff. So in this case we'll be gaining 72 additional points of fire safety. Just be aware that these effects don't stack, so placing 2 fire stations next to one another won't give you twice the area effect bonus. Buildings that are already supplied have a gray diamond indicator. Another important detail is that the effects from public service buildings not only apply to houses, but to every other building in range as well, making the impact that certain buildings have on the attributes much larger. Public buildings that fulfill a specific need apply their buffs in a slightly different way, as you can see with the market. It'll split into the market need, which is supplied to all residence buildings in range, in this case 30, and the general area effect, which is applied to every other building in range. The developers have said they wanted to take the initial buffs concept to a higher level to give players a broad system of area effects, which also adds another layer of decision making. So in addition to public service buildings, production buildings also provide buffs, and this leads to some very interesting gameplay choices. Early game you'll come across a product for your tier 1 population called piliers or hats. In previous Anno titles you would place the production building that produces these outside the main city area, but in Anno 117 it now has an area effect that lets each affected building produce +1 income, so in this example we would generate an extra 41 income by placing it here. In another case, the garum works produces garum, which, when we produce enough for our entire island's population, gives us +2 income and +1 happiness for each residence, regardless of where we put it. But it also has an area effect that gives us another or an additional +1 income but -2 in happiness. At this point you have to decide, does the extra income compensate for the drop in happiness? And happiness itself is also a consideration in and on itself, because you get +1 happiness for all houses on this island. And for argument's sake, let's say there's 100 houses here, so +100 happiness. Then if you place this building within reach of 50 buildings, so -2 times 50, in the end the change in happiness equals 0. So this gives you something to play around with and determine where you'd get the most value out of it. I guess this is a perfect segue into the next question. how do building buffs provide a bigger gameplay challenge? So let me ask you this. Can you remember what your islands would look like in older Anno games if you've played them? You would have this main city area where housing was mixed in with public service buildings, and then spread around across the map you'd have these hotspots of production chains with their own warehouses, and they wouldn't be connected to your city in any way. Trying to find the perfect layout with just houses and service buildings would be hard enough, at least it was for me. But now when you try to fit in different production buildings as well, it'll be a bigger challenge to try and be as efficient as possible without having too much overlap. And in Anno 117, at some point relying on just one source to increase health, for example, won't work. So it's also a matter of necessity to try and fit in production buildings to benefit from their buffs. Because again, placing two copies of the same production building next to each other won't have a stacking effect. But you can stack the same attribute bonus when it comes from two different buildings, such as a hospital and an olive press, which will both increase health. At this point, research also starts to play a role to improve the output of buildings you've already built. But overall, I think it's clear by now that building buffs really offer more depth to your average Anno experience, where providing for a need has a more meaningful and influential effect on how you build your city. Now, like I said, this would be a very short and to the point overview, so if you've enjoyed this video, then give it a like to help it reach more people, and subscribe for more gaming content. I also like to hear your thoughts on the content I make in general, so always feel free to just drop me a comment on a video or a community post. And if you want to see more of Anno 117 Pax Romana, I also made some videos on the attributes, for example, and the need system, so check those out if you want to. For now, thank you for watching and see you in the next one. Bye guys.